3 sheriff's deputies were walking toward my private dock, and the president of my HOA looked like she'd already won. Nearly 50 of my neighbors stood behind her with their phones raised, waiting to watch me lose my property. Vanessa Holloway pointed straight at me without the slightest hesitation. "That's him," she said. "He's blocking access to HOA property." I didn't answer. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and watched the water move beneath the cedar pilings. The lake ignored the flashing patrol lights reflecting across its surface. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. Pine trees swayed in the breeze. Gulls drifted overhead. The air smelled of cedar and fresh water. If you ignored the crowd gathering at my gate, it looked like every other sunrise I'd spent on Lake Ashford over the past 40 years. Vanessa wanted an audience. She had won. Families lined the shoreline shoulder to shoulder. Children peeked around their parents while several HOA board members exchanged confident smiles. They believed they were about to watch one stubborn homeowner finally give in. Most of the people standing there weren't angry. They honestly believed they had been denied access to something that already belonged to them. I couldn't blame them. They'd heard the same story for months. The deputies stopped at the locked gate. None of them reached for the chain. None of them asked me to unlock it. They simply looked. One deputy studied the weathered private dock sign. Another let his eyes settle on the old brass Mercer family plaque fastened to the first piling. He paused, just for a second. Then he looked back toward the dock. I noticed. Vanessa didn't. She stepped forward before anyone could ask a question. "We've sent violation notices for months," she announced. "He keeps ignoring them. Residents have every right to use this dock." She sounded absolutely certain. But certainty isn't evidence. The senior deputy rested one hand on his radio. "Is this the property listed in the 911 call?" "Yes," Vanessa answered immediately. "Then let's verify the parcel before we do anything else." Her smile faded for the briefest moment. Then it returned. "You don't need parcel numbers," she said with a dismissive laugh. "Everyone here knows this belongs to the HOA." The deputy didn't argue. He keyed his radio and quietly read the address to dispatch. Then he waited. So did everyone else. Conversations faded. Phones slowly lowered. Even the children stopped talking. It's amazing how quickly confidence becomes uncertainty when procedure enters the conversation. I took another sip of coffee. My father used to tell me that people can argue over almost anything. Memories, fences, even lakes. But recorded property lines don't care about opinions. At the time, I thought he was talking about land. Standing there beside the dock he built with his own hands, I realized he had been preparing me for a morning like this. The dispatcher's voice finally came back over the radio. She repeated the parcel number once, then stopped. The pause lasted only a few seconds, long enough for the senior deputy to slowly lift his eyes from the radio and look directly at me. Vanessa never noticed the change in his expression. I did, and in that quiet moment, I realized the biggest mistake she'd made wasn't calling 911. It was assuming the sheriff's office was about to investigate the wrong property owner. Vanessa mistook the deputy's silence for agreement. She turned toward the crowd with the relaxed smile of someone who believed the difficult part was already over. "I told everyone this wouldn't take long," she said. "Once they verify the address, he'll have to unlock the gate." A few board members smiled back. Someone near the rear of the crowd even clapped once before stopping, embarrassed by the sudden quiet that followed. Families began setting coolers on the grass. Folding chairs opened one after another along the shoreline. Children wandered toward the water until their parents gently called them back behind the chain. Lake Day looked ready to begin. Only the deputies seemed in no hurry. I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against the cedar railing with my coffee still in my hand. The morning breeze carried the smell of pine across the lake. Small waves tapped softly against the pilings beneath my feet. Everything felt peaceful except the people. None of the deputies touched the gate. None of them treated the dock as if it already belonged to the HOA. They simply watched. One deputy looked at the weathered private dock sign again. Another followed the line of the fence until his eyes settled on the old brass Mercer family plaque. He paused there for a moment before looking back toward Vanessa. I noticed. She didn't. She stepped closer with the confidence of someone delivering a rehearsed presentation. "We've documented this for months," she said. "Violation notices, board meetings, resident complaints. We've followed every HOA procedure." The senior deputy nodded politely. "I understand." She smiled. "Good. He waited another second before asking a single question. Who told the board this property belonged to the association? Vanessa answered without hesitation. Our documents. Which documents? She turned toward one of the board members. He immediately raised a thick blue HOA binder as though its weight alone settled the matter. Everything's right here. The deputy looked at the binder but never reached for it. Do you have the recorded deed? The smile on Vanessa's face grew just a little tighter. This isn't a courtroom. No, ma'am, he replied evenly. It isn't. He rested one hand on the hood of the patrol SUV. That's why we're verifying the property first. Nobody spoke. The breeze fluttered one of the HOA banners near the walking trail. Somewhere across the lake, a boat engine started and quickly faded into the distance. The radio crackled again. Dispatch repeated the parcel number, then asked the deputy to stand by while another county file was checked. I saw the smallest change in his expression. Barely noticeable, but it was there. He wasn't looking at the HOA binder anymore. He was waiting for the county. Vanessa folded her arms and looked back at the crowd, trying to keep the confidence alive. My father used to say that truth never rushes. It doesn't have to. It simply waits for everyone else to finish talking. Standing there beside the dock, watching the deputies ignore assumptions in favor of records, I had a feeling the conversation was about to move somewhere Vanessa had never expected. And once it did, I wasn't sure she'd know how to find her way back. The deputy lowered the radio, but he didn't move toward the gate. He didn't look at me, either. Instead, he walked a few slow steps toward the edge of the gravel driveway. Most people standing there never noticed what caught his attention. I did. Half buried beneath a layer of pine needles sat an old concrete survey monument. My father used to clear it every spring with nothing more than a small wire brush and a garden hose. Property lines don't disappear, he'd tell me. People just stop looking for them. The deputy crouched beside the marker and brushed away the dirt with the palm of his hand. A weathered brass survey cap appeared beneath the dust. He leaned closer and quietly read the identification number stamped into the metal. The younger deputy walked over without being asked. Together, they compared the number with the parcel information displayed on the computer inside the patrol SUV. Neither man spoke. They didn't have to. Their silence was beginning to draw more attention than Vanessa's confidence. Around us, conversations faded. A homeowner who had been live-streaming the confrontation slowly lowered his phone. Another resident looked from the survey marker to the private dock sign, as though seeing both for the very first time. It's remarkable how quickly people start noticing details once certainty begins to crack. Vanessa stepped forward before the silence could grow any larger. "Deputy," she said with a polite laugh, "that's just an old survey marker." "Maybe," he replied. "Maybe not." She folded her arms. "Our attorney has already reviewed all of this." "I'm sure they have," he answered calmly. "But I'm reviewing today's complaint." The smile on her face tightened. The HOA has maintained this waterfront for years. Maintenance and ownership aren't always the same thing. His voice never changed. Neither did his expression. He simply stood, looked toward the shoreline, and followed an invisible line from the survey monument to the first piling of my dock. His eyes stopped on the old brass Mercer family plaque. Just for a second. Then he looked back at Vanessa. My father polished that plaque every spring after checking the survey marker. Back then, I thought it was just another weekend chore. Now I understood why he always did both on the same morning. One marked our name. The other marked our boundary. Together, they told the whole story without saying a word. The senior deputy keyed his radio once more. "Dispatch," he said evenly. "I'd like county records to verify the recorded owner associated with this parcel before we proceed." Vanessa frowned. She couldn't hide it this time. "You're calling county records?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because when ownership is part of the question, that's where the answer usually begins." Nobody moved. Even the breeze seemed to settle for a moment. Somewhere inside the county offices, someone was opening a property file that had been sitting quietly on a shelf for nearly 40 years. Vanessa still believed that file would support the story she'd spent months telling the neighborhood. I looked at the old brass plaque, then at the survey marker beside the gate. My father had trusted both long before he trusted anyone's opinion. A few minutes later, I finally understood why. Vanessa hated unanswered questions. You could see it in the way she kept glancing toward the deputies instead of the dock. She wasn't worried about me anymore. She was waiting for someone in uniform to confirm the story she'd been telling for months. The confirmation never came. Instead, the deputies kept looking. They studied the gate, the survey marker, the private dock sign. Finally, their attention settled once again on the old brass Mercer family plaque. It was only a small piece of metal. Most people had walked past it for years without giving it a second thought. That morning, it suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Vanessa stepped forward before the silence could grow any heavier. "Deputy," she said with a confident smile, "this really doesn't need to be complicated." "Property usually isn't," he replied. "People sometimes are." A few homeowners exchanged uncertain looks. The easy confidence that had filled the shoreline earlier that morning was beginning to disappear. Nobody left. Nobody argued. They simply waited. Waiting has a way of changing people. The longer they stood there, the more they stopped listening to assumptions and started watching details. Vanessa noticed it too. She turned toward the crowd instead of the deputies. "Everyone here knows this dock has always been part of our waterfront," she announced. Several people nodded automatically. They'd heard the same thing at board meetings, in newsletters, welcome packets, community emails. After hearing the same story often enough, most people stopped asking where it came from. My father never did. Every spring, before he checked the dock for loose boards, he checked the survey marker beside the gate. Then he'd wipe the brass family plaque clean with an old cotton rag. I used to think he was simply taking pride in his work. Years later, I realized he was preserving two things at once. One marked the boundary. The other marked the family that built everything inside it. The senior deputy let Vanessa finish before asking another question. "When did the association acquire this property?" She blinked. "Just once. We've maintained it for years." "That's not what I asked." Silence. A real silence this time. Even the children stopped talking. One HOA board member quietly opened the blue binder he'd been carrying since the deputies arrived. He flipped through page after page. Faster now. The confidence from earlier was gone. Vanessa reached for the binder without looking inside it. "Everything we need is documented here," she insisted. The deputy glanced at the binder, then slowly shook his head. "HOA policies explain how an association operates," he said. "They don't establish ownership." No one challenged him. They couldn't. It was the first sentence that separated neighborhood rules from property rights, and everyone standing there understood the difference. I looked across the water as a light breeze carried tiny ripples beneath the dock. My father once told me that land is almost never lost in a single day. First, people stop remembering. Then they stop asking. Finally, someone rewrites the story. Standing there that morning, watching the crowd quietly question everything they thought they knew, I realized we were no longer trying to prove who owned the dock. We were trying to discover who had started telling a completely different story, and why. While the deputies waited for county records to finish their verification, my thoughts drifted somewhere no flashing lights could follow. Long before there was an HOA. Long before Ashford Shores had sidewalks, stone entrance signs, or neighborhood newsletters. Back when this stretch of shoreline was little more than a quiet piece of lakefront surrounded by pine trees. My father, Robert Mercer, saw something here that nobody else did. In 1985, he bought the property after nearly 7 years of working overtime for the county highway department. Every Friday evening, he'd empty the extra cash from his wallet into an old coffee tin above our refrigerator. He called it the Lake Fund. I remember asking him why he didn't simply borrow the money like everyone else. He smiled without looking up from the survey map spread across the kitchen table. "Anything can be bought," he said, "but earning it teaches you how to protect it." At the time, I thought he was talking about money. Years later, I realized he was talking about responsibility. When construction finally began, there was no contractor directing the project. My father built the dock himself. My uncle helped set the cedar pilings. A few neighbors volunteered on weekends. I was barely old enough to carry a toolbox, but Dad always found something for me to do. Hand him a wrench. Hold the tape measure. Sweep away the sawdust. If you're going to inherit something, he'd say, you should help build it first. Before the first piling touched the lakebed, he visited the county offices more than once. He checked the survey. Then he checked it again. He confirmed every setback, every permit, every property line. One evening, I watched him trace the boundary on a folded plat map with the eraser of a yellow pencil. "The dock has to stand in exactly the right place," he said, "because one day, somebody may forget where the line is." I laughed. The idea seemed impossible. Who would ever question something that had stood peacefully for decades? He smiled, but didn't answer. Fathers sometimes know which lessons time will eventually teach better than they ever could. The day we finished the dock, he reached into a small cardboard box and pulled out a polished brass plaque. It simply read Mercer family. Nothing more. He fastened it to the first cedar piling near the entrance, stepped back, and nodded with quiet satisfaction. Why put our name on it? I asked. He tightened the last screw before answering. Because someday someone who never met us will stand here. I want them to know this dock wasn't built by an organization. It was built by a family. Standing beside that same plaque decades later, I finally understood why those words mattered. Every fishing trip with my father began there. Every 4th of July ended there. Every quiet sunrise Ellen and I shared over 2 cups of coffee began with the sound of those cedar boards beneath our feet. To Vanessa, the dock was another waterfront feature that looked good in a brochure. To me, it was 40 years of ordinary moments that had quietly become the foundation of a family's life. That's why I never argued with her. You don't defend memories by raising your voice. You defend them by standing on the ground where they were made and trusting the people who built the foundation long before anyone else ever questioned it. As I looked back toward the deputies waiting beside the gate, I realized my father hadn't simply left me a piece of lakefront property. He had left me something much more valuable. He had left me a history strong enough to outlast someone else's story. People who have never owned waterfront property usually think the value is measured by the view. They see calm water, expensive homes, boats tied to long wooden docks. They're only seeing the surface. The real value is much quieter. It lives in the routines that slowly become part of your life until you can't imagine beginning a day without them. Every morning before sunrise, I followed the same path my father had walked for years. Coffee in one hand, gate key in the other. I unlocked the chain, rested my fingers against the weathered Mercer family brass plaque, and stepped onto the dock. I never planned to touch it. I simply always did. Some habits become traditions before you even realize they're being passed from one generation to the next. The cedar boards greeted me with the same familiar creak every morning. In the spring, the air carried the scent of fresh rain and pine. During the summer, a light mist floated across Lake Ashford until the first sunlight slowly burned it away. Autumn scattered bright maple leaves across the dock, just as it had when my father swept them into neat little piles before breakfast. Even winter had its own rhythm. The shoreline grew quiet except for the distant sound of geese landing somewhere beyond the frozen cove. Those details never appeared on a property appraisal, yet they were the reason the property mattered. After Ellen passed away, the dock became the one place where life still felt familiar. Most mornings, I carried 2 coffee mugs without thinking. I'd reach the end of the dock, set one beside the empty cedar bench, then quietly pick it up again with a small smile. Grief doesn't disappear overnight. It softens, one ordinary morning at a time. The lake helped me through more mornings than I can count. No legal document could ever explain that. To someone driving past, the dock was simply a structure built over water. To me, it was where my father taught me to tie my first fishing knot, where Ellen laughed every time I insisted I could predict the weather better than the local forecast, where my grandchildren skipped stones until the sun disappeared behind the trees. Every scratch in the railing held a memory. Every season left another one behind. As Ashford shores continued to grow, I noticed something changing. New residents stopped referring to it as the Mercer Dock. They called it the Lake Dock, then the Community Dock, eventually just the dock. The family quietly disappeared from the conversation long before anyone questioned the property itself. That realization stayed with me. Ownership rarely begins disappearing at the courthouse. It begins disappearing in everyday conversations. First, people forget the name. Then they forget the history. Finally, they assume it belongs to whoever tells the story most. Often, standing beside the old brass plaque that morning, watching deputies patiently wait for county records while my neighbors gathered beyond the locked gate, I realized this had never been a fight over cedar, concrete, or shoreline. It was a fight over memory. My father spent years building a place where our family belonged. Vanessa spent months convincing people it belonged somewhere else. One story had been built board by board, sunrise after sunrise. The other had been printed on glossy paper and repeated until it sounded true. Before long, Everyone standing at that lakeshore would discover which story could survive when the paperwork finally caught up with it. Looking back, the first warning didn't come from Vanessa. It didn't come from a violation notice, a lawyer's letter, or the morning she called 911. It came from a little boy carrying a fishing rod nearly 3 months earlier. I was replacing one of the weathered cedar boards near the end of the dock when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. A young family appeared carrying folding chairs, a cooler, and enough fishing gear to spend the afternoon on the lake. The father smiled and waved. "Good afternoon," he called. "Are we early for community dock hours?" I looked at him for a moment, certain I'd misheard. "Community dock?" I asked. He nodded. "That's what the HOA welcome packet says." There wasn't a trace of entitlement in his voice. Only honest confusion. I walked toward the gate and unlocked the small pedestrian latch just long enough for us to talk more comfortably. "Would you mind showing me that packet?" I asked. "Of course." He reached into his backpack and handed me a professionally printed folder with the Ashford Shores logo embossed across the front. Heavy paper. Sharp photography. The kind of welcome packet people trust without a second thought. I turned the pages slowly. Trash collection schedules. Clubhouse hours. Pool rules. Walking trails. Everything looked perfectly ordinary until I reached the center spread. There it was. A full-page photograph of my dock glowing beneath a summer sunset. Whoever took the picture knew exactly where to stand. The private dock sign was outside the frame. The locked chain wasn't visible. Most telling of all, the old brass Mercer family plaque had been hidden behind the first cedar piling. Underneath the photograph were 6 simple words. Exclusive community waterfront access. Nothing else. No parcel number. No disclaimer. No explanation. Just 6 carefully chosen words beneath one carefully chosen photograph. I closed the folder and handed it back. "I'm sorry," I said. "This has never been community property." The father's smile disappeared. "Really? Really?" He looked embarrassed. His wife apologized immediately. "We honestly thought it belonged to the neighborhood." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm not upset." They quietly gathered their things and started walking back toward their SUV. Then the little boy stopped. He looked at the dock one last time before pointing toward it. "Dad," he asked, "if it isn't theirs, why is it in the book?" His father opened his mouth but couldn't answer. Neither could I, because that simple question had already become much bigger than one family looking for a place to fish. Someone had chosen that photograph. Someone had written that caption. Someone had approved thousands of copies before they were handed to every new homeowner in Ashford Shores. That wasn't an accident. It was a decision. I watched the family drive away before walking back onto the dock. My eyes settled on the old brass Mercer family plaque. It had been there for decades. Solid, visible, honest. Yet somehow it had quietly disappeared from every photograph the HOA wanted people to remember. Standing there with the welcome packet still fresh in my mind, I realized the biggest problem wasn't that my neighbors believed the dock belonged to the HOA. The biggest problem was that someone had spent months teaching them to forget who it had belonged to all along. The next morning, I drove straight to the Ashford County Recorder's office instead of calling the HOA. There wasn't much point arguing with a brochure. My father had already taught me what to do when someone questioned your property. "Don't argue with opinions," he'd say. "Find the paper that existed before the opinion." The recorder's office looked almost exactly the way I remembered it. Worn limestone walls, old oak counters, shelves filled with records that had quietly outlived generations of property owners. Trends come and go. Property records stay. I filled out a request form and asked for every document connected to our lake parcel, beginning with my father's original purchase in 1985. A clerk disappeared into the archive room and returned a few minutes later carrying a thick property file. She placed it on the counter with both hands. The first page was the original warranty deed bearing my father's signature and the county recording stamp. The next documented the legal transfer into my name after he passed away. Behind those were the shoreline construction permit, inspection approvals, and every recorded improvement associated with the dock. I turned each page slowly. Nothing had changed. The ownership history was as steady as the shoreline itself. I wasn't looking for a surprise. I was looking for certainty. From there, I drove to the county survey department. The chief surveyor welcomed me into a drafting room where oversized plat maps covered nearly an entire table. He carefully unrolled the original survey and traced the boundary with one finger. It began at the concrete monument beside my gate, crossed the shoreline exactly where the dock started, and continued to the final marker hidden among the pine trees. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind ever since the young family showed me the HOA brochure. Has the association ever received an easement across this property? He searched the county database, reviewed the historical filings, and slowly shook his head. No recorded easement. No public access agreement. No recreational right-of-way. Nothing. I nodded without saying anything. That answer mattered more than any photograph in a welcome packet ever could. A brochure can suggest almost anything. A recorded easement either exists or it doesn't. Before leaving, I ordered certified copies of everything: the warranty deed, the survey, the subdivision plat, and the easement search. I wanted the complete file in my hands before anyone had another chance to explain it differently. That afternoon, I carried the binder into Claire Whitmore's office. She spread every document across the conference table and read them in complete silence. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she reached for a colorful subdivision map that had been included in one of the HOA's planning packets. She rotated it toward me. "Look at this carefully," she said. The legal boundary was accurate. The survey hadn't been altered, but the blue shading used to represent community recreation stretched visually toward my shoreline without clearly stopping at the property line. It wasn't technically false. It was simply designed to encourage the eye to see one continuous waterfront. Claire tapped the edge of the map with her pen. "This isn't how someone changes ownership," she said quietly. "It's how someone changes perception." I looked from the glossy illustration to my father's 40-year-old deed lying beside it. One document existed to preserve the truth. The other existed to shape a story. And for the first time since that little boy asked why my doc appeared in the HOA book, I realized we weren't investigating a simple misunderstanding anymore. We were tracing the moment someone decided the story would become more valuable than the facts. Claire called the next afternoon. She didn't waste time with small talk. "I think we found the first real crack," she said. "Come by when you can." When I arrived, the county records were neatly stacked at one end of the conference table. In their place sat several folders collected from homeowners inside Ashford Shores. Claire rested her hand on them for a moment. "The deed tells us who owns the property," she said. "These tell us why everyone believes something else." She opened the first folder. Inside was one of the subdivision's original marketing brochures. Across the cover, smiling families walked along the shoreline beneath the words "exclusive lake living." Halfway through the brochure, I found a photograph that immediately stopped me. My dock. The angle looked familiar. Too familiar. Whoever took the picture had carefully framed it, so the private dock sign was outside the shot. The lock chain was gone. Most noticeably, the old brass Mercer family plaque had disappeared behind the first cedar piling. The dock looked like it belonged to the neighborhood because every detail suggesting otherwise had been quietly removed. The caption underneath was even more interesting. It didn't claim ownership. It simply read, "Enjoy exclusive waterfront living." Claire watched me read it twice. "Notice what it doesn't say," she said. She was right. It never mentioned a deed, a parcel, an easement, or the HOA. It invited readers to reach their own conclusion without ever making a statement that could be challenged. The second folder contained archived HOA newsletters gathered from longtime residents. Most were exactly what you'd expect: landscaping reminders, holiday events, pool maintenance. Then one issue from the previous summer caught my attention. The headline read "Expanded Waterfront Recreation." Beneath it sat another photograph of my dock. Different season, different photographer, the same careful framing. Once again, the Mercer family plaque was hidden. The private dock sign never appeared. Even the article itself spoke in carefully chosen language, describing expanded community waterfront opportunities without identifying where those opportunities actually existed. Claire leaned back in her chair. "One brochure could be a mistake," she said. "Two could be coincidence. This isn't either." She slid one final folder across the table. Screenshots from the HOA resident portal filled the pages. Fishing mornings, kayak meetups, sunset socials, lake day. Every event pointed residents toward the same stretch of shoreline. Nobody reading those announcements would have questioned the location because the brochures had already answered that question for them. The story had been planted long before the events were scheduled. I looked out the office window for a moment. The families who attended those gatherings weren't trying to take someone else's property. They honestly believed they had been invited onto something the community already owned. They weren't creating the misunderstanding. They were living inside it. Claire reached beneath the folders and placed one last unopened file on the table between us. A handwritten label stretched across the tab. HOA Board Communications. She didn't open it. Neither did I. Instead, she looked at me and said quietly, "If these folders explain how the homeowners came to believe the story." She rested one finger on the unopened file. "This one may explain whether the people telling it ever believed it themselves." I stared at the folder without touching it. For the first time since this entire mess began, I had the feeling we were about to stop asking what happened and finally discover why. By the time Claire finished reviewing the HOA board communications, one thing had become impossible to ignore. The HOA wasn't backing away. It was speeding up. 3 days later, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox with the Ashford Shores seal stamped across the front. I carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and set it beside my father's original deed. The contrast made me pause. One document had been quietly protecting my family's property for nearly 40 years. The other had been printed less than a day earlier. Only one of them carried real authority. I opened the envelope. Vanessa Holloway had signed the letter herself. According to the notice, I was creating an ongoing obstruction of community waterfront access by keeping the gate locked. The HOA demanded that I remove the chain within 7 business days or face daily fines, legal action, and the suspension of community privileges. I read the letter once. Then I read it again. Nothing inside it changed the property. It only repeated the story. Later that afternoon, Claire read the notice from beginning to end before quietly setting it on the table. "This wasn't written for a courtroom," she said. "It was written for the neighborhood." She tapped the first paragraph with her pen. "If enough homeowners receive letters like this, they'll stop asking where the authority comes from. They'll simply assume it exists." That explained everything I'd been seeing since the young family walked down to my dock with their fishing poles. The brochure created the expectation. The newsletters repeated it. The warning letters reinforced it. Every piece supported the one before it. The story had become stronger than the evidence because most people never had a reason to compare the two. Claire drafted our response that same afternoon. Calm, direct. Every statement supported by certified documentation. Attached behind her letter were copies of the recorded deed, the boundary survey, the easement search, and a formal request that the HOA immediately stop describing my private dock as a community facility in any publication, meeting, or resident communication. We mailed the package by certified mail with return receipt requested. 4 days later, the green card came back signed by Vanessa herself. She now had every document that mattered sitting on her desk. I expected the HOA to pause, maybe even quietly correct the mistake. Instead, they escalated. Blue Lake Day banners appeared at the subdivision entrance. Community emails encouraged families to bring kayaks, fishing poles, and picnic lunches. Volunteers organized registration tables. Directional signs appeared along the walking trail leading toward my shoreline. None of them mentioned my dock by name. They didn't need to. By then, everyone already knew exactly where they were expected to gather. 2 days later, another certified envelope arrived. This one claimed the locked gate created an unnecessary inconvenience by preventing residents from enjoying planned community activities. Claire read it without changing her expression. Then she closed the folder. "Interesting," she said quietly. She received the documents and chose to keep going. She placed both HOA notices into the same evidence file beside the brochures and newsletters we'd already collected. The pattern was complete now. This was no longer about misunderstanding a property line. It was about what happened after the truth had been delivered. I looked across Claire's office toward the courthouse, standing on the opposite side of the street. We weren't trying to prove ownership anymore. That question had already been answered. From this point forward, we were documenting decisions. And I had a feeling the next file Claire opened would reveal the one decision Vanessa would never be able to explain. Claire called just after 8 the next morning. Her voice was calm, almost ordinary. That usually meant she'd found something important. "Don't come to the office," she said. "Meet me at Harper's Diner." Claire never chose diners over conference rooms unless someone else was involved. 20 minutes later, I spotted her in a quiet booth near the back. Sitting across from her was a man I recognized immediately. David Collins. He'd lived in Ashford Shores since the first homes were built. He rarely spoke during HOA meetings. rarely took sides. The kind of neighbor most people forgot was even in the room. As I sat down, David glanced toward the front window before sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. "I think these belong with your file," he said quietly. Inside were copies of HOA board meeting minutes that had never appeared in the newsletters sent to residents. The first few pages looked routine enough. Budget approvals, landscaping contracts, pool repairs. Then one heading caught my attention: Waterfront Identity Initiative. I kept reading. Vanessa had proposed creating what she described as a unified lake experience to strengthen neighborhood identity and improve property values. On the surface, it sounded harmless. Then I reached the presentation attached behind the proposal. The first photograph showed my dock. The second showed the walking path leading toward it. The third showed families enjoying the shoreline during a previous community event. Every image had one thing in common. The old brass Mercer family plaque was missing. So was the private dock sign. Even the lock chain had disappeared from view. They hadn't changed the property. They had changed what people were allowed to see. David quietly pointed to another page. "Read that one." It was a summary of the board discussion. One board member had asked whether additional legal review would be necessary before expanding waterfront activities. Vanessa's answer filled only a single sentence. "Legal review is already being handled. Proceed with communications as planned." Nobody asked another question. Nobody requested a deed. The meeting moved on to landscaping contracts. Claire reached into the envelope and removed one final document. It wasn't part of the meeting minutes. It was an email sent several days after Vanessa signed for the certified package containing our deed, the survey, and the easement search. The subject line was simple: Lake Day Planning. I read the message once. Then again. Vanessa acknowledged receiving every document. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Continue preparing for Lake Day as scheduled. We'll address the ownership narrative afterward." I looked at Claire without saying a word. She didn't need to explain it. Vanessa hadn't questioned the paperwork. She hadn't disputed the property file. She hadn't challenged the survey. She had separated the facts from the story and decided the story could wait until after the event. Claire quietly folded the email and slipped it back into the envelope. "This doesn't change who owns the dock," she said. "The county settled that decades ago." She paused. "It changes what she knew before." She kept going. I looked through the diner's front window as morning traffic rolled past. Lake Day was only a few days away. Vanessa still believed it would prove she'd been right all along. She had no idea that the most important evidence in the entire case wasn't hidden in a courthouse. It was sitting inside her own email, waiting for the right moment to tell a completely different story. Claire closed the envelope and slid it back into the folder. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. We didn't need to. The email had answered the last question that truly mattered. Vanessa had received the certified deed. She had received the survey. She had received the easement search. She knew exactly what the public record said. She simply chose to keep moving forward. "We're finished investigating," Claire said at last. "Now we prepare." The next morning, we met outside the Ashford County Administration Building just after the doors opened. The courthouse lawn was still damp from an overnight rain, and the air smelled clean enough to make the whole place seem unusually quiet. We weren't there to create a scene. We weren't there to ask anyone to take sides. We were there for one reason. If Lake Day unfolded the way we expected, every question needed to have the same answer no matter which public office received it. Our first stop was the county recorder's office. The clerk recognized my name immediately and disappeared into the archive room. A few minutes later, she returned carrying the property file we'd already reviewed. Claire requested fresh, certified copies of everything. The original warranty deed, the legal transfer into my name, the shoreline construction permit, the recorded survey, the easement search. One by one, each document received a new certification stamp before being placed inside the black binder. Claire organized the pages with colored tabs. "No one should have to hunt for the truth," she said. "It should be the first thing they see." From there, we walked across the hallway to the county survey department. The chief surveyor spread the original plat map across a drafting table and traced the boundary from the concrete survey monument beside my gate all the way to the end of the dock. Nothing had changed. Not the shoreline, not the boundary, not the ownership. At Claire's request, he prepared a short written verification confirming that the recorded property lines remained exactly as originally surveyed and that no recorded easement granted public or HOA access across my property. It wasn't new evidence. It was another independent confirmation of the same facts. Our final stop was the sheriff's office. A lieutenant welcomed us into a small conference room and accepted the binder without comment. Claire walked him through the timeline one document at a time. The brochure, the newsletters, the welcome packet, the board presentation, the certified legal notice, the signed delivery receipt. Finally, the email referring to the ownership narrative. She never raised her voice. She never exaggerated. She simply allowed the documents to explain themselves. The lieutenant reviewed the file carefully before closing the binder. If deputies respond to this address, he said, they'll verify the recorded property information before taking any action. Claire nodded once. That was all she wanted to hear. Outside, the clouds had cleared completely. Sunlight reflected across the courthouse windows as we walked back toward the parking lot carrying the same binder we'd arrived with. Nothing about the property had changed that morning. Only the preparation had. The trap wasn't designed to embarrass anyone. It was designed to remove every opportunity for confusion. Meanwhile, back at Ashford Shores, volunteers were hanging Blue Lake Day banners across the neighborhood entrance. Families were packing coolers. Children were loading fishing poles into the backs of SUVs. Vanessa continued sending cheerful reminders through the HOA portal, convinced the biggest community event of the summer would finally prove she had been right. She never realized the outcome had quietly changed the moment she signed for that certified envelope. By the time the first patrol SUV rolled toward my dock, every public office that mattered would already know exactly where the property line ended. All that remained was for someone to ask the question Vanessa had spent months hoping no one ever would. Lake Day arrived beneath a cloudless sky. By 8 o'clock, the shoreline looked exactly the way Vanessa had imagined it. White canopy tents lined the grass. Folding chairs faced the water. Kayaks rested beside the walking trail. Children laughed while volunteers checked names off registration lists. Blue HOA banners welcomed everyone to what was supposed to become the neighborhood's biggest event of the summer. Vanessa stood near the entrance, greeting homeowners with the confidence of someone expecting applause. Then my truck rolled quietly into the gravel parking area. Claire stepped out beside me carrying the same black binder we'd assembled at the courthouse. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just a binder. A few moments later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived and parked near the gate. Conversations faded almost immediately. Vanessa smiled as she walked toward them. "Good morning," she said. "I'm glad you're here. We're still waiting for him to remove the chain." The senior deputy returned the greeting with a polite nod. "Before anyone proceeds," he said, "we need to verify the property information connected with today's complaint." Vanessa answered without hesitation. "This is HOA Waterfront." The deputy accepted the binder from Claire and placed it on the hood of the patrol SUV. He opened the first tab. Certified warranty deed. He compared the parcel number with the information displayed on his computer. It matched. He turned the page. Boundary survey. His finger followed the property line from the survey monument beside the gate to the shoreline and then directly to the dock. Another match. He turned one more page. Easement search. He read it slowly. Then he stopped. No recorded public access. No HOA easement. No recreational right-of-way. He closed his eyes for just a moment, mentally checking everything against the county information already available to him. The younger deputy quietly walked over to the weathered survey monument and confirmed the identification number. Then his eyes followed the boundary to the first piling, where the old brass Mercer family plaque caught the morning sunlight. This time, other people noticed it too. An older homeowner adjusted his glasses and read the words aloud. "Mercer family." The whisper spread through the crowd. "I never noticed that before." "Neither did I." The senior deputy closed the binder and looked toward Vanessa. His voice remained calm, professional, measured. "Ma'am, the recorded county documents associated with this parcel identify the dock as private property. The deed, the survey, and the recorded access information are all consistent with one another." Nobody interrupted him. Nobody argued. Claire stepped forward and handed him one final document. The certified mail receipt bearing Vanessa's signature. Attached behind it was her email instructing the board to continue preparing for Lake Day after receiving the property records. The deputy read both pages carefully before returning them to the binder. He didn't accuse her of anything. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "These documents indicate the association had notice of the recorded property information before today's event." For the first time since I had met Vanessa Holloway, she had no immediate answer. She looked toward the HOA board. No one spoke. She looked toward the homeowners. They weren't watching me anymore. They were looking at the banners, the welcome packets, the registration table. Then, one by one, their eyes settled on the weathered brass Mercer family plaque that had been sitting in plain sight for decades. My father used to tell me that truth doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives one page at a time. Standing beside the dock he built with his own hands, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The advantage had never been hidden inside some complicated legal trick. It had always existed in ordinary public records, patiently preserved for 40 years, quietly waiting for the day someone cared enough to read them before believing the story someone else wanted them to hear. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound came from the gentle waves tapping against the cedar pilings beneath my dock. The blue HOA banners still fluttered above the walking trail. Folding chairs remained lined up along the shoreline. Coolers sat unopened beside picnic blankets. Everything looked exactly the way it had 10 minutes earlier. Yet everything had changed. One by one, homeowners stopped looking at me. Their attention shifted to Vanessa. She stood perfectly still, the confident smile she'd worn all morning slowly disappearing. She looked toward the HOA board as if someone would step in and explain everything away. No one did. Board members who had spent months standing beside her suddenly found great interest in the ground beneath their feet. The silence finally broke when the older gentleman who had read the Mercer family plaque cleared his throat. "If this dock was never HOA property," he asked quietly, "why were we told Lake Day was being held here?" No one answered. A woman standing near the registration table reached into her folding chair and pulled out the same glossy welcome packet I'd seen months earlier. She opened it to the photograph of my dock. "This is what we received when we bought our house," she said. "Why doesn't it mention that it's private?" Another homeowner opened his copy. Then another. Within moments, welcome packets were spread open all across the shoreline. People weren't arguing. They were comparing. The same photograph. The same carefully chosen angle. The same missing details. No private dock sign. No locked gate. No Mercer family plaque. The realization spread quietly from one conversation to the next. I thought this belonged to the neighborhood. So did we. Nobody ever told us otherwise. A volunteer slowly lowered the registration clipboard onto the table. Another untied one of the large Lake Day banners and folded it without being asked. There wasn't going to be a celebration anymore. There couldn't be. The deputies remained near the entrance, calm and professional, simply reminding everyone to remain outside the marked private property boundary. They didn't lecture anyone. They didn't take sides. Their job was finished. The facts had already spoken. Vanessa tried one last time to steady the moment. She stepped forward and forced a smile that no longer reached her eyes. "Our attorney will review all of this," she said. The words hung in the air. Then a middle-aged homeowner quietly replied, "I thought that already happened." No one laughed. They didn't need to. Trust doesn't collapse with shouting. It collapses with silence. Families began folding chairs. Coolers were loaded back into SUVs. Children climbed into back seats, asking why Lake Day was over before it had even started. Parents searched for answers that no longer seemed simple. As the crowd slowly dispersed, more people stopped beside the first piling. They looked at the weathered brass Mercer family plaque for a moment before walking away. It hadn't changed. It had simply been overlooked until the truth gave everyone a reason to notice it. Claire stood quietly beside me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. Across the parking area, volunteers carried away the last blue banner while the registration table was folded and loaded into the back of a pickup truck. Watching it disappear, I finally understood what my father had meant all those years ago. Land is rarely lost all at once. First, people forget the name. Then they forget the history. Finally, they begin believing a different story. That morning, the story ended. Not because anyone shouted louder. Not because anyone humiliated another person. It ended because ordinary homeowners saw the truth for themselves. And once they did, no brochure, no meeting, and no confident speech could ever persuade them to forget it again. A month later, Lake Ashford looked exactly the way it always had before the arguments, the notices, and the flashing patrol lights. The water reflected the morning sky without choosing sides. Small waves rolled beneath the cedar dock. A pair of loons drifted quietly across the cove, while the first fishing boat of the day eased toward deeper water. Peace has a way of returning one ordinary morning at a time. Ashford Shores slowly settled into a new routine as well. The Blue Lake Day banners never came back. Updated welcome packets quietly replaced the old ones. The photographs of my dock disappeared. Community newsletters stopped referring to waterfront amenities the association didn't own. No dramatic announcement was ever made. The story simply faded away because it could no longer survive beside the truth. Over the following weeks, several neighbors stopped by the gate while I was having my morning coffee. None of them came looking for an argument. Most simply wanted to introduce themselves the way neighbors probably should have from the beginning. A few apologized for believing what they had been told. I always gave them the same answer. You trusted the information you were given. I probably would have done the same. That usually surprised them. But blaming the homeowners had never been the point. They hadn't written the brochures. They hadn't approved the newsletters. They had simply believed the people they trusted. One Saturday afternoon, the young family with the little boy returned carrying a homemade apple pie. The father smiled as he handed it to me. "We thought we owed you a proper thank you," he said. I laughed and invited them to stand by the gate for a while. The little boy walked straight to the first piling and looked up at the weathered brass Mercer family plaque. This time he didn't ask a question. He simply smiled. "Now I understand why it's there," he said. I rested my hand against the old brass plaque, feeling the familiar grooves beneath my fingertips. "It was never there to keep people out," I told him. "It was there to remind people who built this place." He nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Maybe it did. A few days later, Claire stopped by one last time. She handed me a thin folder containing the final correspondence, confirming that the property records remained exactly as they had always been. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever needed to. Before leaving, she looked toward the dock and smiled. "Your father left you more than land," she said. "He left you certainty." After she drove away, I carried the folder into my study and placed it beside my father's original deed inside the cedar cabinet he had built with his own hands years earlier. The file belonged there, right beside the history it had protected. The next morning, I followed the same routine I had followed for decades. Coffee in one hand, gate key in the other. I unlocked the chain, rested my fingers on the Mercer family plaque, and walked slowly to the end of the dock. The cedar boards answered with the same quiet creak I'd heard since I was a boy. Across the lake, the first sunlight spread over the water while the morning mist slowly lifted from the shoreline. For just a moment, I could almost picture my father standing beside me, checking the old survey marker before smiling with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed every job should be done the right way the first time. That was the lesson he had really left behind. Property isn't protected the day someone challenges it. It's protected years earlier, through honest work, careful records, patience, and the willingness to leave something worth inheriting. Stories can be rewritten. Brochures can be reprinted. Signs can come down. But truth has a remarkable habit of waiting, quietly, patiently, until someone finally decides to look for it. As I watched another sunrise settle across Lake Ashford, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving the HOA wrong. It was knowing that one day my grandchildren would walk down the same stone path, place their hands on the same weathered brass plaque, and step onto the same dock with complete confidence that some things, when they're built with care and protected with integrity, really can last for generations.